The influencers had already told the public who Kilmar was supposed to be. On March 22nd, 2025, the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 that Kilmar Abrego Garcia's removal to El Salvador was unlawful. That should have ended it. Instead, the public got memes. What's funnier than giving a Zionist puppet president unfettered authority to bypass the most basic of due process checks? Are illegals entitled to rights as a citizen? No. But how do we check if someone is here legally or not? We don't allow for a simple check of legal residency in front of a judge. They didn't check to see if he was here legally or not before shipping him off to another country, or they would have seen that he was here legally. Dear influencer class, I am not in the mood for your dumbass memes. They aren't backed by truth, so they aren't funny. Leading into Holy Week, the public wasn't watching court dockets. They were with family, at church, trying to have one Sunday where nothing insane happened. The Supreme Court had already ruled. Unanimous, final, obviously accurate, legally justifiable, and ignored. But the story never made it to the public in legal terms because this wasn't a battle of fact. It was a war of narratives, and both sides of the regime had already chosen theirs. MAGA, now an effective rebrand of the Cheney GOP, sanctified the deportation with memes and Catholic theatrics. The institutional left, who wouldn't have cared if Kilmar were a blonde woman from Sweden, activated because he was brown and therefore politically useful. It didn't matter to them if he beat his wife or trafficked people or anything else. He was a cudgel against Trump, and that was enough. So as you can see, the court handed down law. Here's how the political MAGA and Dem classes handed down propaganda. On April 17th, 2025, Senator Chris Van Hollen flew to El Salvador. He wasn't there to bring Kilmar home. He wasn't there with enforcement power. He was there to meet a man the courts had already ruled was unlawfully deported, then pose for a photo and leave. He got the handshake and the narrative. Look, we tried. That same day, the White House brought out Patty Morin, a grieving mother whose daughter, Rachel Morin, was murdered in Maryland, to the press podium. Patty had nothing to do with Kilmar's case. Her daughter wasn't killed by him. She wasn't connected to his court record. But her presence served a political purpose. She was used as narrative cover for one of the worst presidential scandals of my lifetime. The regime knew how bad this looked, so they reached for the most emotionally manipulative tool in their arsenal. And as disingenuous and awkward as Senator Van Hollen's photo op was, he wasn't wrong. Trump world knew exactly what it was doing. They brought out a grieving mother as a political prop. The administration used her as a shield, hoping the weight of her tragedy would obscure the Supreme Court's ruling. It was an act of emotional manipulation, deplorable. And as awful as it is to realize, Hillary Clinton's commentary rings true more than anyone wants to admit. They brought out the victim's mother. A few hours later, the White House posted an image, not a policy announcement, not a statement of compliance, a meme. It took a real New York Times headline, Senator meets with wrongly deported Maryland man, and defaced it. Wrongly was crossed out. Maryland man was crossed out. In its place, MS-13, illegal alien who's never coming back. It looked like something crafted to go viral, just enough irony to be waved off, just enough cruelty to make the point. That's what makes this moment so important to document. A ruling wasn't answered with compliance or even with a serious legal argument. It was answered with content. A Supreme Court decision replaced by a punchline. It wasn't some fringe account. It came from the official White House X account, the same one used for presidential announcements, the same one followed by journalists, foreign leaders, and courts. It should have been posting Kilmar's return order, or at the very least a serious legal challenge explaining why it didn't have to. But it couldn't, because there was no argument. Instead, it mocked the thought of due process for everyone legally residing in America with digital graffiti. Over this same time frame, the Make America Grift Again surrogate machine came online. Jack Posobiec posted "Welcome Home, Kilmar" alongside a margarita emoji and a snarky image of Senator Chris Van Hollen shaking Kilmar's hand in El Salvador. Laura Loomer declared he was never coming back. Will Chamberlain went on Lisa Booth's podcast to frame the case as one of asylum fraud, and none of them brought a single competent argument as to why Kilmar was scooped up off the street and taken straight to a plane to another country when he had legal right to be here. None of these Khan Incorporated clowns filed anything. None testified under oath. They were playing their role. The MAGA regime had already chosen to ignore the court. Now it needed cover. Jack Posobiec helped amplify the smear. He did claim Kilmar was a wife beater. He did claim Kilmar was a human trafficker. He did claim Kilmar was an MS-13. He didn't have to prove any of it. He didn't have to file it in court, but he posted it to millions. We don't know what he is. His wife seemed to freeze up when asked about the protection order against her husband from years ago, but Kilmar has no criminal record. Loomer labeled the courts naive and corrupt and said legal protections were tools of the enemy. Will Chamberlain didn't dispute the court ruling. He said Kilmar should have been given an interview. When someone asked him why they didn't do that, he reframed it as a Trump administrative mistake based on poor lawyer work. We'll never mention that Trump's admin can reopen or open a new case right now. These three didn't just deflect. They manufactured an alternate legal record. At the same time, DOJ missed compliance deadlines. They had been ordered to provide updates, step-by-step details on how they would facilitate Kilmar's return. They didn't. The court granted them time. They wasted it. They were asked to explain what steps had been taken to initiate contact with El Salvador, to coordinate re-entry, to ensure Kilmar's safety. And they answered with delay, silence, or deflection. At hearings, they showed up with little more than vague statements and legal stalling. The courts kept asking. DOJ kept dodging. Even while the DOJ was missing compliance deadlines, they had the legal authority, opportunity, and responsibility to bring to the court what the influencers were screaming online. They could have done exactly what the influencers claimed had already happened. Present the evidence to a judge. If Kilmar really was MS-13 or a trafficker or a danger, they had the opportunity to say so in court, but they didn't. They didn't even try. All the smears, all the accusations, all the new evidence tweeted by regime surrogates, none of it was submitted under oath. None of it was argued before the judge. The government chose narrative over law, just like the influencers. And yet the administration began presenting a fully formed justification in public, and that's when the cover story crystallized. Kilmar was no longer a man granted protection by a U.S. judge in 2019. He was now a criminal, an infiltrator, a gang member, a predator, a national security threat. Fox News ran with it. Maryland man appeared in sarcastic scare quotes. Civil accusations, never part of any immigration case, were now headlines. Police statements were reported as verified fact. Daily Wire and Blaze parroted the narrative, referring to Trump's actions as national security prerogative. Legal orders became blurry footnotes. Propaganda became the dominant record, and the very people leading this effort, the same Zionist influencers who provided cover for some of the most heinous crimes in the history of our country against children. In February 2025, many of them, Posobiec, Liz Wheeler, Rogan O'Hanley, Mike Cernovich, attended a private White House event and left holding binders labeled Epstein Files Phase 1. They promoted the event as a bombshell. They later admitted it was a dud, redacted logs, old names, nothing new. But these same people who couldn't or wouldn't expose the powerful are the ones defining Kilmar's story. They couldn't hold Epstein's network accountable, but they could smear a man granted protection by U.S. law. That's when it became clear this wasn't just a character hit, it was regime-wide damage control. The system had committed an illegal act. The court had called it out, and the influencers were deployed to replace the legal record with a moral indictment. This wasn't an isolated moment, it was a three-part strategy. Smear the subject, Frame Kilmar as a gang member, wife beater, trafficker, never prove it. Smear the defenders. Say Van Hollen supports terrorists. Say legal aid lawyers are Marxists. Say Christians who defend due process are traitors. Deny the law. Say SCOTUS didn't mean what it said. Say the ruling was vague. Pretend the president can just say no. This is how they moved the Overton window from deportation was unlawful to returning him would be immoral. I've said before publicly that President Trump should never have turned himself in for arraignment during the political prosecutions against him. I stand by that. Because in those cases, the court wasn't operating on law, it was operating on agenda. When the process is corrupt, submission isn't justice, it's legitimization. But that's not what happened here. In Kilmar's case, the system did work. The courts ruled. They ruled correctly. A federal judge granted protection. Multiple courts affirmed it. The Supreme Court issued a unanimous 9-0 decision, making it final. And it wasn't the courts that broke the law. It was the president. It was the Department of Homeland Security. It was the executive branch that ignored the judiciary. That's not resisting tyranny. That's tyranny defying the law itself. If Kilmar was truly a threat, the DOJ could have filed a motion to reopen. They could have presented the evidence in court. They could have used any legal pathway available to reverse the 2019 withholding order, but they didn't. Because they knew the law wasn't on their side, so they manufactured a new one. We are in a post-courtroom regime. In this regime, the court may speak, but if the influencers don't approve, the state doesn't comply. In this regime, you can be deported in violation of federal law, and when the court demands your return, the president can post memes about it instead. In this regime, influencers act as unofficial prosecutors. They use hearsay as gospel and hashtags as sentencing guidelines. And in this regime, the people cheer he didn't get due process, not for MS-13, not for trafficking, not for domestic violence, not for anything. If you care about law, that should matter. If you care about order, that should terrify you. Because what they did to him, they'll do to you next. And you won't even get a trial, just a headline and a hashtag, and then you disappear.